becomes the major target. There is no history of the modern world that does not begin with Africa. The modern world does not begin in Europe. It begins with Africa. Here is the problem of Howard Zinn's History of the American People. It is weak on race. It is weak on the understanding of Africa in the framework of the modern world. What am I saying about this? And this, I want to emphasize this over and over and over again. Revolutionary Pan-Africanists are different than reactionary Pan-Africanists or cultural Pan-Africanists. Kwame Ture, as a thinker, represented revolutionary Pan-Africanism. As the All-African People's Revolutionary Party argues, we are for Pan-Africanism and scientific socialism. You cannot be a Pan-Africanist, which is a way of saying I am for the liberation of Africa and the diaspora, without talking about the economic reorganization of economic life on the African continent. Now, if you don't want to go there, don't call yourself a Pan-Africanist. Come up with a different word, pork chop nationalist maybe.
Stop.
The only Pan-Africanism is the Pan-African, genuine Pan-Africanism, is the Pan-Africanism that fights not just for the political independence of Africa, but against neo-colonialism. This is the Pan-Africanism of Kwame Nkrumah, of Sekou Touré, to a certain extent Jomo Kenyatta, and certainly, by that measure, the greatest Pan-Africanist in the last 50 years has been Muammar Gaddafi. The brutal murder, I say this over and over and over again, and if you can morally accept that your black president killed Muammar Gaddafi, the greatest Pan-African, then he's your president. But if you have a moral problem with that, and the regime that he represents, you can't mess with him. And I say that without fear of successful contradiction. Pan-Africanism is African unity, not to say that we are all African peoples. It is unity for the economic development and independence of Africa. That's what Pan-Africanism is about. And we'll talk about Muammar Gaddafi later. Okay, now, but then we go from monopoly capitalism to what we call state monopoly capitalism. That is where these large monopoly corporations merge with or take over the state. This is what we have today on steroids. This is what we have. Simon Johnson, liberal, and when I say well-respected, I'm talking about by the elite. Well-respected, MIT professor economist, writes a book in 2010, 13 banks. We'll give out the thing in a minute, the book. 13 banks. And what he says is that a silent coup has taken place. Well, it took place 100 years ago, but he just realized it. Where Wall Street controls Washington. I don't think we can. Wall Street controls, he calls it a silent coup. State monopoly capitalism. Now, there were a number of theorists that had already come to this conclusion. One was a German Marxist and social democrat named Rudolf Hilferding. Rudolf Hilferding wrote a book in about 1909, I think it was, called Finance Capital. And what he said is that these big industrial corporations were controlled by the banks that financed them. You see what I'm saying? And if there was not a bank to control them, the big monopoly corporations themselves created banks out of their profits. Okay? Just like in the recent period, a GM Corporation, General Motors, creates GMAC as its financial arm. So if you buy a General Motors car, a Pontiac, a Chevrolet, whatever, you go to the financing arm of General Motors to get the financing for the car. But it went over into mortgages and other things. But now, because the banks were where the money was, the banks became the principal controllers of corporations. So state monopoly capitalism was also defined as finance capitalism. Now we're going to get right to Cassandra. Finance capitalism, or in its large global and world systems manifestation, imperialism. Now, when we talk about this type of global economic system, we're talking about a world economic system controlled through the centers of capitalist finance. That is, the City of London. When they say the City of London, they're not talking about the City of London. The city means the financial district of London. Okay. Or Wall Street. Or the similar thing in Germany, in Frankfurt. Or Hong Kong. In other words, a world economy controlled by a few European banks that have the resources, the money, to invest all over the world. But that investment means nothing without the state, the military. All of the wars of modern history, of the modern epoch, have been wars to protect the investment of European nations. Hold on, wait a minute. I want to say a couple of quick things. Every war of the 20th century has either been a war to suppress peoples who they were trying to colonize, who resisted their colonization, or wars between big economic imperialist nations to decide who would control the rest of the world. Hitler was not a madman. Throw that out of your mind. Hitler represented, wait a minute, John. Hitler represented the political interest of finance capital in Germany. Any study of the Nazi Party in Germany shows it going from the 1920s to a bunch of thugs in the street beating up socialists and communists and trade unionists and talking shit and drinking beer and singing ignorant songs and shit, to when Hitler is appointed by the president of Germany in 1933 to become the chancellor. Chancellor meaning the prime minister, the head of government. And they chose the Nazis, which means National Socialist Party. They chose the Nazis to head the government, first of all, because by this time the Nazis had become, while no party could get the majority, it had a large enough constituency and had expressed its commitment to the policies of the bankers in Germany. And they appoint Hitler, the bankers, this is what I'm saying, you've got to see banks and finance capital, to trump the potential of the socialists, the Social Democratic Party, and the Communist Party coming together and becoming an electoral majority. Well, we're looking at something similar. Greece is the test case in Europe right now for this. Hitler becomes respectable when he becomes the instrument of the interest of finance capital in Germany. Number two, well, two things. One, they had to use both the street thug thing of the Nazis, where they had enough of the SS, or was it the SA? The SA back then, stormtroopers, cats that walked around goose-stepping and talking shit, and, you know, would kick your ass. You're ordinary, you protesting. We want freedom of speech at Temple. Here comes some cats gonna roll up on you, man, and whoop your ass. That's what so they had that street thug thing. But the other thing that they had at the higher levels of the Nazi Party were the connections to the political elite of Germany. Now, third point. Germany went to war in 1914 with the other European capitalist countries on the basis of one principle. Germany was the fastest growing economy in the, quote, civilized world. More than Great Britain, which was the major colonial power, more than France, more than the Netherlands, more than anybody. Why should Germany only have Southwest Africa, Tanganyika, I think Rwanda and Burundi, this little bit of Africa, and Belgium, a weak country, have the whole, quote, Belgian Congo? You don't want to redraw the map of Africa through negotiation. We have to go to war. Germany goes to war with its allies, Turkey and Austria, yes. The war ends, and here is what you must understand. This is the narrative, and it's related to the economic thing. World War I ends at the moment of stalemate. The Germans were not defeated militarily. What brings the war to an end is the Russian Revolution. And all sides in the European conflict realize that this revolution, you know, in a situation where there was, again, war and economic depression in Europe, while they're still trying to fight a war, there's a depression in different countries. If the Russian revolutionary example spreads to the rest of Europe, it will be the end of capitalism. Now, that part of the German armed forces who felt that they were betrayed, some said they were betrayed by the bankers, others said they were betrayed by the capitalists, some said they were betrayed by the communists and socialists, that they were stabbed in the back. They always wanted to resume the war. Germany was not defeated. Germany was betrayed. Okay? Hitler and them spoke on. That's what their slogan was. But then they put a profound racist dimension to it. Now, racism of Europeans against Africans or Asians is the bottom line. But here you get the identification of European races, inferior and superior races, with different characteristics. Okay? That Germany represented the Aryan races, the most superior of the European races. And why should Germany, you know, that had produced the great geniuses of Europe and yada, 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 be in this secondary position? And why should Germany be humiliated with this unjust peace after World War I? Hence, Hitler comes to power to settle the problem of the socialist and communist and labor movement in Germany, and to settle once and for all the problem of Germany being cut out of colonial colonies in Africa in particular. Okay? Hence, World War II. The second in 20 years begins in 1939. I won't get into all the details. This is not a war of Hitler. This is a war of finance capital, of bank capital. Every war in the 20th century is either a war of imperialist powers to reorganize the world and the resources of the world, or a war of imperialist powers to suppress either independent African and Asian nations, South American nations, or to beat back anti-imperialist and anti-colonialist movements. That is what it is. You can't get it confused. Don't pay this bullshit no attention in the media. In fact, just on the Syria thing, I posted on my Facebook page. I know a lot of people aren't on Facebook. It's a serious mistake. They can trace you through your email, your cell phone, so don't think, oh, I ain't going to expose myself to the ruling class. But anyway, on my Facebook page, I put up this morning an essay on the media's role, and especially democracy now, the so-called liberal progressive thing, on Syria. And so if you go to my Facebook page, you can look at it. It's very much worth reading. The propaganda about democracy and freedom and the civilized nations and the West and all of that is merely to obscure the imperialist natures of this world. Now, that lasts. The period of monopoly capitalism in this form lasts until 1971. And here's Cassandra's point. In 1971, another basic change in the, I guess you would say, the structure of U.S. capitalism, which again is the leading capitalist nation after World War II, but of the way the capitalist system functions. And this is the period, and you might wish to put it just like this, of the out-and-out, unchallenged domination of all economic and political processes by finance capitalism, which reached its penultimate stage, its highest stage. The world has never seen anything like this. And Cassandra, I agree with her 100%. The world has never seen anything like this, where so few people control the lives of billions of people throughout the world. This is what Simon Johnson means when he talks about 13 banks controlling the entire American economy. If you take it to a global scale, we're probably talking about a few more. You got to talk about the British banks, Barclays, and so on. But never before has an economic elite been so parasitic, so corrupt, so decadent, so anti-people, and finally so arrogant. Every word Hillary Clinton utters, every word Barack Obama utters is cleaved through those who represent Wall Street and finance capital. Hold away, Brandon. Every word. The White House is nothing more than an extension of the big banks. J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Bank of America. I'm not talking about Philadelphia Federal Credit Union. You know what I'm saying? We're talking about the largest banks in the world. The current Barclays bank scandal about manipulating interest rates. It's the way these Maryland farmers operate.
Right.
This is, and always talking about markets. Their war policies, their aggression against independent nations, this sense that they have a right to murder,
Yeah.
sovereign. Listen, I say once again, we as progressives can never forgive the ruthless murder of Muammar Gaddafi. I don't know how many of y'all saw it. If you haven't seen it, you need to see it. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, that's where earlier I wanted to, when you brought up Muammar Gaddafi and Africanism and this kind of, as you say, the restructuring of the political economy of the African continent. I wanted you to speak to this idea that Muammar Gaddafi, one, he supported a lot of infrastructure and different projects in Africa, but also this idea that he was trying to introduce an African currency.
That's right.
Gold dinar.
That's right.
As
That's
they
right.
called it. I want, what I mean?
No, I don't. You're saying it. You're saying it. I mean, in other words, and let me just put it in. Absolutely. What he was doing, the same with Saddam Hussein, the same thing with the Iranian government. What they represent are threats to what is known as the Washington Consensus, the neoliberal or imperialist or U.S. imperialist-dominated control of the global economy. Now, how do you do it? Through World Trade Organization, through the IMF, through the World Bank. But uppermost, the dollar must remain hegemonic. When Saddam Hussein says to break out of these unjust sanctions that Clinton and Daddy Bush have put on me, I will trade oil to Russia, China, and France using either the euro or the renminbi, or we will do it like Venezuela and Iran are doing, or Venezuela, Iran, or Venezuela and Cuba are doing it, through barter. We won't even use a fucking currency. You see what I'm saying? What does that do? That locks the dollar out of the trade in the most strategic mineral in the world, and that is petroleum. By the way, once they went off gold in 1971, in other words, the dollar was no longer valued based upon its relation of the price of gold. You see what I'm saying? Back then, gold was $35 an ounce. Today, gold is $1,500, $1,700 an ounce because of the fragility of the dollar and other currencies. But all currencies, for the most part, are pegged or valued on the dollar. The dollar is the universal currency. That if Kazakhstan wants to trade with Ukraine, they use dollars. So both nations have to have dollars in their central banks in order to trade with each other. Nigeria wants to trade with, let us say, Burkina Faso. It uses dollars, unless they make some other arrangement. But the dollar is what everybody trades in. But the most important dollar, and here is the dollar that carries the greatest weight in international economic relations, and that is petrodollars. That is why Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, all of these Gulf Arab states are nothing but, what do you call them? Not just colonies, but financial extensions of big U.S. oil corporations and banks. The trade in oil is conducted through petrodollars, oil dollars, dollars that circulate specifically for the buying and selling of oil. Countries that threaten that. Muammar Gaddafi was the greatest threat to this. Believe it, a country of 6 million was the greatest threat to it. Because, as John pointed out, he was talking about an African economic union. Hold it, Cassandra. As I pointed out last time, the African Union, which is the successor to the Organization of African Unity, its declaration and its conference that formed it was in Sirte, Libya. The declaration forming the African Union is called the Sirte Declaration, S-I-R-T-E. Sirte is the city where they assassinated Muammar Gaddafi. Don't forget it. Don't trivialize it. Don't minimize that political event. And judge every politician based on his or her relationship to that. If you're a Pan-Africanist. If you're a bullshit artist, you can. Okay, so now, I just want to complete. This is the period we're in. The laws, both international and domestic law, has been written to make sure that Wall Street and the major banks are in this hegemonic position. In 1998, under the first black president, Bill Clinton, you know, he played the saxophone and liked to run around, so he had to be a black man. Under the first black president, 1998, they withdrew or overturned the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act was instituted in the Great Depression under the New Deal under President Roosevelt to separate investment banks from commercial banks. In other words, they wouldn't allow big banks to toy around with my little savings and my little retirement funds and turn that into their casino where they speculate with. But once you allow them to come together, then you create these mega banks which could use the deposits, including our debit cards, everything. They unleashed those dogs on the people. That's what the repeal of Glass-Steagall did. Under, again, the first black president, Bill Clinton, who we love so much because he was for us. Okay. Now, the current 2007, the current collapse, where for the first time in the contemporary history of finance capital, a major Wall Street investment bank collapses, Lehman Brothers, in September 2008. The collapse of Lehman Brothers sent a panic throughout the financial world, both here and abroad. If Lehman Brothers could collapse, who was next? To save the system, first Bush and then Obama, led, and they had nothing to do with it, they were just the figureheads. The government, headed by the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve, over the course of a year, pumped $12 trillion into the financial system. Now, there's a study by Senator Bernie Sanders out of Vermont who says it was $16 trillion. We do not know. We have no idea. This is more of a state secret than who the CIA, you know, whatever. They pumped everything into saving finance capital. The Obama administration had this economic stimulus package of $865 billion, less than $1 trillion, 40% of which were tax cuts, wasn't even direct money. May have been more than 40%. When Bernie Sanders talked about the $16 trillion in loans, loan guarantees, and buyouts of so-called toxic equities and all, we'll talk about it in a minute. When he talked about that, he said that the United States not only did this use taxpayer monies and all of that to save U.S. banks, that's bad enough, these few thieves and so on, but to save overseas banks that was, as they put it, were exposed to U.S. Equities or U.S. stocks that were bad. Now, to understand this 12 or 16 trillion dollars, you have to understand that the U.S. economy in total is 17 trillion dollars. Okay? The economy, in other words, close to 90% of the value of the economy was thrown into saving finance capital. Now, here is our problem. It was so extensive that it bankrupted national governments. When they talk about we have to go into austerity programs now, you hear this austerity, got to cut welfare. That's why I know the healthcare thing ain't going to go through. They can have it on paper, but there's not going to be anything. We have to lay off workers. Workers have to accept, one city, I forget where, Scranton. The city workers, 5 people, all them kind of people. Now y'all got to work for minimum wage. In other words, you do, and then you don't know if you got your health care. You do better going down and getting a job at McDonald's. Because at least that's $8 now. Y'all saying we got to work for $7.56. The shrinkage of the government and the services that the government provides to human beings and the wages and incomes of people who work for the government. The destruction of the Philadelphia public school system and the privatization of it. If you care about anything, if there's anything human left in this country, how can you allow public education to be destroyed? And then tell you, what's going to be better because we're going to have charter schools. And y'all Negroes can have your Afrocentric one. And you can pour libations. It's a cruel joke. And anybody that participates in it is as guilty as those who have manufactured it. And they have to be treated as such. Public education or no education. That's the slogan. Either you finance education for all children at an equal whatever, or no education. Now, where's all of this coming from? To save the finance system, these too big to fail banks. Remember that slogan? They're too big to fail. If Goldman Sachs fails, then the whole economic system will go down. So we have to save Goldman Sachs in order to save you little people, right? That was the logic, and they kept pumping that. Now they have saved Goldman Sachs and the rest at the cost of $12 or $16 trillion, whatever, and now the government is bankrupt. The federal government and the state government and the local governments are bankrupt, right? So now, here we are on the cusp of another, they say a double dip recession or a Great Depression. In the 1930s, they softened the Great Depression by government spending. And then, of course, war spending brought us out of the Depression. Now we're in a situation where the government is bankrupt. Who pays to pull the economy out of the crisis? This is a crisis of a new stage produced by the dominance of the most parasitic class of people, maybe in human history. Okay, now I just wanted a couple. Oh, yes. Lastly, this is an existential crisis, a crisis of the existence of the system. You can say an existential or a systemic crisis. I like the word an existential crisis of capitalism. This is where we are now. It is more than a Great Depression. This is a crisis which can bring the whole social system down. People talk about, I got to move out of New Orleans. The Negroes is too violent. They killing too bad down here. You understand? People from New Orleans, I ain't going back home. They killing too bad down here. Right? This is an existential crisis that undermines the social system and transforms normal human beings into enemies of society. They see society and everybody in it as their enemy. We talked about the diminished black male. I want to keep that concept out here. People that I was debating with not here today, but to understand behavior, you have to understand the social processes operating upon people who behave in a certain way. This is the holistic approach, totalities rather than I'm going to look at every individual that kills somebody. You know, he was snorting coke. He was on the pipe. Wait, sorry. But the diminishment of the black people as a whole, the reducing of black people to a population whose existence, whose death does not matter to the society. Let them die. Give them dope. You see what I'm saying? And I would just say, do your own sociology, do your own observation. Go to Broad and Gerard. They ain't going to rob you. Observe the methadone clinic. Not the unemployment office. The methadone clinic. Because the methadone clinic is the people that have, their unemployment went out many years ago, and they can't get welfare. You see the ravages of this system. This is existential. Now, this is what we call, using the Latin phrase, a momenti mori. A crisis of this magnitude is what we call a momenti mori, a reminder of death. Systems, social systems, at times go into crises that are so profound that you have to refer to that crisis as a momenti mori, a reminder of death. We are in such a crisis. It is just like if you have a serious illness. Now, you might recover from that illness, but that illness, let's say a serious cancer, brings you face to face with death. Okay? Cancer is such a devastating disease because it is systemic. It is existential. You see what I'm saying? It is life or death. If you don't pull through, you die. If you pull through, you know, you just, oh my God, you know. This is a type of crisis. And it is a crisis that if you are observant, you don't have to understand all the complexities. If you are observant, it makes you know, and if you're thinking, that you have to think about an alternative. Life cannot continue like this. You see what I'm saying? This is not anti-religion. Don't go to church and be shouting and praying. I'm not anti-religious. Don't become victim to the displaced, the false consciousness that is preached from many pulpits. And that's not a function of Christianity. I say that without, you know, that's not Christianity. That's preachers. Some would say pimps. But now, the other thing about this is a world systemic crisis of capitalism. Some people argue, well, China and the emerging markets like Brazil and India and Russia and maybe South Africa and Mexico, they are protected or immune from the systemic crisis. I argue with a friend of mine all the time. He's an older man, and so therefore maybe that's an excuse. But he's fixated on this thing of China as the China will pull through this. China's capitalism, which is state capitalism, authoritarian capital, will transition and will not become a prey to the worst of this this depression that we're going into. I don't think so. China's economy and China's political system are very fragile. Very fragile. We could talk about that in a little while. Oh, one last thing. So it's a world systemic crisis. The major form of the crisis at this moment is sovereign debt. In other words, governments are powerless in their present form to stimulate their national economies. And that is why all of the Western nations are rooting for China to be a strong economy, because China can pull us out of this. If China doesn't pull up, quote, doesn't pull us out of that, we're dead in the water. Because the national governments do not have, on the present basis of taxation and the way things are organized financially, they do not have the basis to pull the national economies out of this. Don't have it. This election will decide nothing. It will decide nothing. It ain't even Tweedledee and Tweedledummer. It's just two cats basically the same perpetrating for different interests of the financial clique. Now, finally, in moments like this, we are compelled to see, and it's not, you don't have to look too far, economic depression, we acknowledge that, permanent war. We are in a warfare situation. We are fighting wars on a global basis. If you read the New York Times or whatever newspaper last week, they openly admitted the overwhelming naval and air power that the United States has put off the coast of Iran. The Economist, who is best known for having predicted the financial collapse of 2007-2009, a guy by the name of Nouriel Roubini. And he's very well known for this. He's very well respected for him having predicted this crisis. Nouriel Roubini recently made a statement, wrote an article. Said, we are approaching the perfect storm. The economies of the main centers of capitalism are going into another recession, which he meant depression. The governments are in chaos. What we see the Republicans and all that back and forth, because they cannot come to a consensus of what to do to make the economy grow again and to produce jobs. And now, of course, in the United States, the racialized economy, white people are losing jobs. White students are graduating and have to work as a waitress or a pizza delivery person with all this debt. White people are, now the quote unquote people who count are being hit. Economic depression and war. Internal repression. This is the big question. This is where we are. There is no American dream. The American dream is over. The only option, the only way out, is the path of consistent struggle. I don't think this will be a civil rights decade. This will be an epic struggle. You cannot put a time frame on this. We do not know how long it will be. If I were to make a prediction, I would say this. First of all, just like Occupy Wall Street spread from Occupy Wall Street and kind of caught fire in Europe and other places in the world, what is going on in Europe in terms of the fight back and the growing class struggle will eventually spread here. Because there are so few people and they are so isolated, and if Occupy Wall Street didn't do anything else, now I understand the problems of racism and white people and all that shit, but what did Occupy Wall Street say? 1% of the population was saved while the rest of us went down the tubes. And they made it simple. 1%. We are the 99%. With contradictions, I understand all that. But we are the victims. And really, 1/10 of 1%. This means that in the consciousness of tens of millions of people is the idea that a small clique is ripping us off.
Yes.
They control all the politicians, etc., etc., etc. This means that economic fight back, strikes, demonstrations, riots, taking over city halls, taking over factories, is going to be what defines the moment. Okay, number one. Because those who run things are so minuscule, and because their overall political position is so fragile, they can be easily overwhelmed. But on the other side, their knowing this means that their response to social uprising will be more ruthless in the beginning.
She said it. She said it. She
Huh?
said it.
It's going down.
Yeah. Now, that's what I think, but that doesn't mean it inevitably has. There is no inevitability about it.
Yeah.
People might not respond in the way that they're
That's
expecting.
right. That's right.
And-
Exactly. That's the whole problem. We cannot predict that people could turn on each other, and that is going to happen. It is happening.
Yes.
Well, go ahead, Chris.
You know, I was going to say, on the article that we put out on Facebook late last night that I read, about the whole idea of consumerism.
Because right now, this crisis is happening